Have you ever wondered what the personal life of a ruthless dictator is actually like? The answer is simple, usually very fucked up. What did you expect? However, within that relatively small circle of extremely well-known dictators, Saddam's personal and private life was even more messed up than you probably know. Are the private lives of all megalomaniacal dictators messed up? Well, the answer to that question is a resounding yes. What did you think we were going to say? Stalin? He likely drove his second wife to suicide, bullied his son, but in truth, Stalin's parenting style, especially between father and son, was likely not all that different from many at the time and in the place. Hitler? Before he came to power, he was in love with his niece Geli. He may or may not have been involved with her sexually, but we know that he was in love with her and was extremely jealous of any attention she gave other men. She killed herself, as Hitler was poised to take control of Germany. Still, in all honesty, aside from the bizarre and evil craziness of his plans to conquer the world, Hitler was the most gentlemanly of the dictators when it came to his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, and most other women. Mao Zedong was a serial child molester who had his men scour the country for beautiful 12 and 13-year-old girls. But most people did not know about it until after his death. It is a fact still overlooked in official Chinese circles. These men and others had bizarre criminal or tragic personal lives for their victims, but on the whole, they tried to keep these events private. Not Saddam. While his deeds behind closed doors weren't exactly publicized, most Iraqis, especially those at the top, knew that Saddam's personal life was just as cruel and twisted as his treatment of his people. Now, before we delve into Saddam's sadistic private life, we're going to take a moment to give you a summary of his rise to power in Iraq. He was born in a village near the large town of Tikrit in 1937, in central Iraq. Then, the Kingdom of Iraq with Faisal I on the throne, propped up by the British government. In 1957, Saddam joined the Ba'ath Party, a secular party focused on pan-Arab nationalism and a unique form of socialism. Saddam rose to notoriety for his part in a poorly carried out and unsuccessful assassination attempt on Iraq's top general and power behind the throne, General Abd al-Karim Qasim, in 1959, and was forced into exile in Egypt, where he met the Iraqi Ba'ath Party's leadership and began his rise to power. In 1968, Saddam played an essential role in the coup that brought the Ba'athists to power. By 1979, Saddam, who had an innate ability to maneuver and plot, had become president of Iraq. He used the wealth of the country to promote loyalty among trusted subordinates, and nearly bankrupted the country with his spending on large projects around the country, making him quite popular for a time. However, he also used his unscrupulous cunning and brutal repression to maintain control. You likely know the rest: a nearly 10-year war with Iran, the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, his defeat in the First Gulf War, and international isolation. And then the Second Gulf War following 9/11, which ended with his discovery in a spider-like hole near his hometown, and his eventual trial and execution. Behind the scenes. That's what most people know. What happened behind the scenes? In 1963, he married his first cousin, Sadija. Before you get all bothered, you should know that in nearly 20 U.S. states, first cousin marriage is legal. And no, they're not all in the Deep South. Another handful of states allow marriage between first cousins if they are too old to have children or infertile. In the Muslim Middle East, cousin marriage is common. There are definite downsides, but one of the primary reasons is to keep a clan united with few outsiders involved. To this day, the larger family organizations like clans and tribe relationships are exceedingly important in the Middle East. There were 5 children from Saddam's marriage: 3 girls, Ragad, Rana, and Hala, and his 2 infamous sons, Uday and Qusay, who took their places at Saddam's side in the Iraqi power structure. Both sons were beaten, yelled at, and among other things, forced to execute political prisoners from a young age. Saddam's rationale behind this? He needed to toughen them up and get them used to a life as future leaders of his brutal administration. And maybe most disturbing of all, to occasionally remind them what happens to traitors and enemies in Saddam's country. Of Saddam's 2 sons, Qusay was more like his father. He was quieter, reserved, and more calculating, especially in contrast with his brother. As he grew older, he placed or maneuvered himself into a variety of key positions. setting himself up to rule after his father's death. Qusay was highly involved in Iraq's intelligence-gathering agencies and ran the security services, especially as they pertained to Saddam's safety and suppressing dissent. Uday, the older brother, was originally Saddam's crown prince, but his partying, very obvious and public cruelty and boorish behavior, and his killing of Saddam's personal valet and food taster in 1988 made Saddam realize Uday could never be trusted with running the country. By the way, Uday was never punished for killing the valet, Kamel Gigio. It's not like no one knew who did it. Likely spurred on by his mother who hated the valet, Gigio was killed at a gathering, where drunken Uday cracked him over the head with something heavy, then stabbed him to death with an electric carving knife in front of dozens of people. Why was Uday's mother mad at the valet? In 1986, Gigio introduced Saddam to Samira Shabandar, who became Saddam's mistress and then second wife. Samira was married at the time, but Saddam made her husband an offer he couldn't refuse, and married her after a very fast divorce. After that, Uday was given some prestigious jobs that he couldn't really mess up, and he continued a life of drugs, drunkenness, and debauchery, which included murder, sadism, sexual torture, and not-so-secret orgies, which most of the young women and girls could not refuse to be part of. Saddam considered him an idiot, and often mused out loud about having Uday killed. Though Iraq under Saddam was not a theocracy and Muslim clerics and their followers were largely left out of power, Islam and a conservative history meant that Saddam's daughters were good for one thing. Well, two things. The other one was marriage. Saddam forced his daughters into relationships that would strengthen his family and his grip on power, from the top levels down to the many poor villages in the country. In no sense were Saddam's daughters free, and while they did enjoy the perks of being wealthy and the influence of having a dictator for a father, they were a means to an end. Though Saddam was married to two women, they weren't the only ones. Throughout most of his reign, Saddam hosted lavish parties for trusted officials, businessmen, and sometimes even foreign guests, either other third world dictators or their representatives. Many of these parties turned into wild, drunken orgies of violence against women, or simply orgies in the more well-known sense. In no way did the women and sometimes girls involved have any choice in the matter. Often, agents of Saddam's various security services would recruit a beautiful girl or young woman for these parties. To keep their parents and families silent, gifts, bribes, and, well, threats were used, sometimes all three. In many cases, fathers and brothers encouraged their daughters or sisters to take part more than once. It resulted in money and gifts, and if she was pleasing enough, perhaps power and influence. Saddam enjoyed torture, not just torture of known political opponents, but of suspects and even regular run-of-the-mill criminals too. Especially in his early years in power, Saddam created an image of himself as the ultimate executioner. He was known to visit jails and the torture chambers of the Mukhabarat, his secret intelligence and security service, and execute prisoners. He also watched them beaten, electrocuted, and killed by others. Many times, Saddam or his henchmen would force a husband to kill a wife or child, or vice versa. Everything about Saddam's life was about dominance. Even worse, the way he expressed this dominance was through terror and intimidation. Aside from the killings and torture, Saddam was known to have beaten his sons and others so everyone could see their humiliation. Moreover, like many abusive people, especially fathers, Saddam was unpredictable. One day he would be lavishing a new Mercedes on someone. The next day, they might be subject to an angry public tirade or worse. Abusive survivors will tell you that one of the worst things about living with an abusive person is not knowing when they will go off. The beatings and other physical punishments were painful and humiliating, but usually lasted a comparatively short time. The waiting and anticipation of what might happen was always there. Even if nothing had happened for years, a person would always know that at any moment, Saddam, or Qusay or Uday, could become a monster. In 1990-1991, when Saddam took hostages to protect vital installations in Iraq against US-led bombing, the world got to see an abuser in action. Saddam would have himself filmed visiting the hostages, laughing, smiling, asking them how they were doing and blaming the situation on the USA. When asked how they were, how do you think the hostages answered? Just like abused children who knew they would be punished for whatever the wrong answer was at the time. Saddam was captured in 2003 during the Second Gulf War. His sons had already been killed in a pitched battle with US forces. Saddam was put on televised trial in Iraq and found guilty of numerous crimes and hanged on TV. Many people complained about the prolonged and botched nature of the hanging, saying it should have been quick and shown the world how Iraq was moving away from that sort of thing. Maybe so, but it was difficult to get too troubled about it. It was a long time coming.